Securities and financial planning offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor. Member FINRA SIPC. The opinions voiced in this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, and financial advisor or tax advisor prior to investing.
Thank you for joining Planning for Win, Financial Guidance in Life. This is Kevin Pinkley, and joining us today is Angela Soper. And today we'll be discussing tips for a healthy and lasting marriage. Thank you for joining us, Angela.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Kevin.
Angela, could you tell the listeners a little bit about your practice and how they could get in contact with you?
Yes, thank you. My practice is in the Heights, so you could reach me through Angela Soper at sopercounseling.com. I see individuals and I do trauma work. I deal with basic issues that people deal with. But my big passion is working on marriages and helping people recover from difficult times.
Well, thank you. Well, so where would you like to start today?
Well, so it seems like there are themes when I'm doing marital therapy, issues that come up constantly. And so there are a few things that I wanted to talk about. One is what we make up. And what I mean by that is typically what happens is an event happens and then there's a reaction from our partners and we don't know why. They just react and it doesn't make sense to us. But in between the event and the emotion is what we make up. So the example that I give is if the trash hasn't been taken out and I'm mad, my husband might not know why I'm mad. It just doesn't make sense. I could take it out later. What's the big deal? But if I make up that he thinks that it's all on me, or he's entitled, or if it's important to me, it's not important to him, then my feelings of anger make sense to him. So, and so many of my couples say, I know exactly what he thinks. I know exactly what she's going to say, and we really don't. We might be right, so sometimes we're not making it up, but often we're making it up. So I saw a couple a while ago, and one of the things she said was, I don't think he really cares about me. And he was shocked because he didn't know where she got that information. And so in parsing that out, we realized that she was making up a lot of stuff based on his behavior.
So would it be accurate to say that perhaps it's our interpretation of what we think's happening or why something's not happening?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, without a doubt. The thing is if we don't own that we're making it up, then we can get into an argument about it. You always interpret me negatively. You always see the worst in me. But it really does help people to settle down a little bit if I own my junk. So I'm making it up. You can't really argue and say I guess you could. You could say you always make negative things up about me. But there's something that softens the emotion when you talk about what you make up. Interpretation would be fine.
Well, I'm glad you used that term, making it up, because when you really think about it, that's exactly what we're doing. Right. And, I use the word interpret, but now that I think about it, that's probably not accurate. We're making it up. And well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So,
it helps people not argue. So going from the event to what we make up to the feeling, the next thing I ask couples to do is make a request. So, because most of us argue about things over and over and over again, and we don't fix it. The argument's over. We're not angry anymore. We just move on. But if we follow a pattern of the event, what we made up, the feeling, and then we bring a request, we're less likely to be arguing about it. So back to the trash thing. That's actually a real Soper household event. And what I asked is, would you please put a reminder on your phone so that you will take out the trash at such and such? And we've never had that argument since, like literally never. So we came up with something that works for both of us.
we're going to have to try that. It's not just common in your household.
Yeah, I know.
So during this process, and I'm just thinking, is it helpful to slow it down before we have a conversation or make it up, as you say? Because a lot of times it's just a reaction,
Yes.
and sometimes we say things that we shouldn't or we
Hmm.
would say differently
Right.
if we slowed it down a little bit. Okay.
Absolutely. So it's so funny. It's almost
Hmm.
like you were been in my therapy office for the last years. Yes. What happens is that people get flooded with
Hmm.
emotion. My mentor is Terry Real. He wrote The New Rules of Marriage. He's out of Boston. He's, frankly, I think, brilliant. But he talks about this whoosh that we have this feeling of anger or intensity, or we get activated by something. And so often we don't think, we just react. So, one of the first things I do with couples is I ask them to let me know what's happening in your body when you start to get angry. Sometimes I'll do it when I'm sitting with them and I can see something happening. I'll say, stop just for a second. What just happened? And some people know immediately what their wish feels like, some people don't. So, they have that feeling of activation. And if you can experience what that is before you're in an argument, the next time you're activated or upset with your partner, you can recognize, okay, this is what's happening. This means I'm getting mad and I need to shut up. So I encourage people to think about a mantra: shut up and breathe. Don't say a word. Slowly, because if you go really fast, you're going to get upset again. So shut up and breathe, take a breath. Along with that, I'll tell people, if you're too upset to have that conversation now, take a timeout. And a timeout isn't just walking away in a huff. A timeout is either hand signals or wait or timeout. And then walk away for 15 minutes and calm down, and then talk to your partner about what you're upset about or what was triggered in you. Do you mind? I feel like I'm saying a lot. Is that okay? May I
Oh
say something?
no,
Okay.
yeah, no. I'm listening. Well, so what I'm hearing is, I mean, you said we should maybe, in some cases, wait a little bit before we have the
Mhm.
conversation,
Right.
if I understood that correctly,
Mhm.
um, because we need to address this, and maybe
Right.
that's not the correct language,
No, that's right.
but because it's not going away,
Hmm.
because it will keep repeating itself,
Right.
and it seems like it's really important to one person, but not important to the other, or so we think,
Right.
or we're
We're
making
making
that
that.
up. Um, so we need to talk about it because it's just going to be building and building probably over the years.
Right.
Okay.
That's right. And along with, you're bringing up a good point too. When along with the timeout, it's so important that the other person understands that the timeout I'm asking for is to protect you and me. So if I know I'm just going to lose it, it's an act of love for me to tell my husband, give me 15 minutes. So I'm not making him wait because I don't feel like talking to him and I'm in a huff. It's that I respect him enough or love him enough to say, I'm not in a good place to have this conversation. But I do come back afterwards because you're right, Kevin. What we do is we bury things. There's a marital researcher named John Gottman, and he says, and I believe this is the correct statistic, something like 67% of the arguments we have in marriage are unsolvable. Right.
Right.
Or they're just repeats. And so what I say to that is, and I can think right off the top of my head after almost 30 years, the arguments that we have over and over and over again. What's helpful, though, is how you handle those arguments. So you don't go off the rails. You don't put digs in there or low blows. But, they're kind of unsolvable. You just keep rehashing them.
So it's okay to be different people because we still love the person we married, but
Yes.
we're not the mirror image of each other.
Right.
And in some ways, that's a good thing. But in
Yeah.
some ways, I don't want to use this word, but I'll say it anyway, conflict.
Yes.
And some things just aren't going to change. But from what I'm hearing is how we process it or handling it is what we can work on, not changing the other person
Right.
or maybe changing ourselves.
Well, that also is an outstanding point because, and I'm somewhat open with couples when I'm working with them because we're all working together on our marriages. And so the examples that I share are examples that my husband knows that I'll share. But yeah, we each have our strengths and we each have our weaknesses. And one of the things my husband said to me a long time ago is nobody has the complete package. So he has strengths that I don't have, and I have strengths that he doesn't have. And I think it takes humility in marriage, because what we do is we're exasperated with our partners. You said conflict. I was thinking I'm infuriated, right? And but if I step back and I have some humility, I have to remember that I see things the way I see them, and this might be a strength of mine, but it's not necessarily a strength of his. But that could easily be turned around. So we've got to be able to embrace the differences in our partners and also understand that we need them.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to say that sometimes we might think that if someone had a different behavior, maybe things would be a little smoother. But I've often thought that we don't want ourselves on the other side of that relationship, because that's not a good thing. And having that other person there is good. And you wouldn't want your spouse to be your identical type of person,
No.
with that type of makeup. That would probably create more problems.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that, it's almost like sometimes we can be polar opposites.
Mhm.
So some couples have somebody who's a type A, very intense, gets everything done, very disciplined, and the other person is more lackadaisical. But the reason why that might work is because the lackadaisical person needs somebody to ratchet up their energy and move a little bit more quickly, and the type A needs to relax a little bit. And so if you can look at that as complementary, or as a complementarian relationship, instead of something that needs to be fixed, it's going to be a whole lot easier.
Well, I've seen that with myself and other people, where you find something that you admire in your spouse, and maybe you don't always admit that, but then when you have a quiet moment around the house and you're sitting there, it's like, I should be more like that person. Or maybe in the moment I should be more like that person,
Right.
with an activity or how they process something.
Right.
And I don't think we probably give our spouses credit enough on that when we're trying to be more like them. In fact, I don't know if we ever give our spouses credit for that, but maybe we should.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and that's such a nice thing to say.
Mhm.
So, and what I also think couples do is we almost assume that they know.
Mhm.
So if you're thinking, wow, I really love this quality in my spouse, I'm not going to say it because he or she knows. But I think often they don't know. And even if they do, it's so nice to hear it. I mean, we all need, on some level, the attaboys and attagirls. And so if you're thinking, gosh, I wish I was more like my wife, or I wish I was more like my husband, what a beautiful thing to share with that person.
I'm going to have to practice that. I think we all need to practice that
I
a little
agree.
more.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about some different things, and I don't know if this is helpful, but sometimes I've seen different people, and maybe even ourselves, and I'll use the word patience. That maybe we need a little more patience. Not that we need to accept something that maybe needs to be talked about, or maybe even changed or modified.
Right.
But patience and understanding sounds like that could go a long way too,
Absolutely.
while we're working towards, I don't want to say changing behavior, but modifying it so that we can work together.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it does take time. That's the other thing that my couples often say in my office is, this is so hard. And it is, because we have our knee-jerk reactions. And you're talking about modifying behavior, and I like that, because I'm a therapist, so I believe that people can change. They have to want to change. But even if they're not changing who they are, they can change or modify their behavior. So, yeah, I think it takes patience and it takes practice. I think about, we expect education to take time. I mean, 12 years of K through high school, and then we go to college and we go to graduate school or whatever we do. And we're patient in that. But with our spouses, we get married and it's like, come on, come with the program. And it doesn't happen that way. So patience is key. And there's some people who are more patient than others.
Okay. Do you find either with couples in general or the couples you work with
Mhm.
that they experience different things at different stages in their marriage? So let's say people in the first 5 years of marriage versus the people who have been married 25 years plus. I mean,
Yeah.
is this a constant or do things kind of evolve into different um, um, complications, if we will, with time that adds on, or does it just not matter and it's a day to day activity that we need to work on?
Yeah. Well, so marriage is harmony, disharmony, and repair. And then you think about the stages in marriage. So, you have the first year to 10 years with no kids.
Mhm.
And that there's a lot of freedom in that. I always tell people with small children, you're in the hardest time of your life because the demands are great. You're tired. The marital relationship often gets put on the side. And you're maxed out, and financially, it's a hard time. So then the kids get older and you begin to get a little bit closer. But then there are also issues with teenagers, as you know. And then kids go to college. And so things are more stressful financially, for example. And then empty nest. And that brings challenges of its own. It's a couple learning how to grow close again. There's also oftentimes great financial freedom that you didn't have in the first, say, 20 to 25 years of your marriage. So that can be a blessing and a curse as you kind of figure out how do we do our finances now that we're more flush than we used to be. So yes, I think that marriages have stages, um, developmental stages, but then I also think there's the harmony, disharmony, and repair that will happen until we take our last breath.
So there's no finish line. No,
No,
okay.
no.
No, okay.
I was talking to somebody recently who told me that they knew of somebody who was getting a divorce after 55 years of
Mhm.
marriage.
Wow.
And, you kind of think at 55 years of marriage, you've got to be at least 75. Aren't you tired?
Mhm.
And it gave me pause. And I remember hearing that. And I said to my husband, we don't ever get to kick back and relax, not when it comes to relationships. And in some ways, we don't really kick back and relax ever. We're always learning something new, or experiencing something different. And I think for some reason, we kind of think that in marriage, we can just stop, put the oars down and chill. And we really can't.
No, I think that would be dangerous.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was looking at the title again, Tips for a Healthy and Lasting Marriage.
Mm.
And I noticed that you mentioned healthy and lasting,
Yeah.
that you can have, and I don't think that was by accident. You can have a lasting marriage, but maybe it's not healthy.
Right.
Would you like to talk about maybe the differences between healthy and lasting
Yeah.
and what we want is both?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a great question. So there are a lot of people who have shared with me that they've stayed in a really unhappy marriage for whatever reason. And there's a level sometimes of toxicity. Even if it's silent toxicity, you can feel it. It permeates the atmosphere. And so it's lasting, but there's no joy or mutual respect or fondness or cherishing. And so, do I think that can change? Most of the time, I do. There are certain things that I tell people that are really hard to turn around. One is untreated addiction,
Mhm.
untreated mental illness, and untreated domestic violence. If you notice, I'm not talking about affairs. I think that affairs, people can heal from them. It takes a long time, but they can heal from them. But okay, I just totally spaced on the question. I'm
Well,
so
I was
sorry.
going to say it was important. You mentioned
Oh, healthy and
untreated,
lasting. Yeah.
untreated,
Hmm.
because sometimes we lump. You mentioned an addiction
Uh-huh.
or abuse. Well, there's a difference between that happening and untreated.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So in a healthy relationship, somebody would say, I love you, but your drinking or pot smoking or whatever is hurting our relationship. And that isn't the time to call the attorneys and call it off. It's the time to say, okay, what can we do proactively? How can I support you in sobriety? And people do that, and they do it successfully. And it takes a village.
Mhm.
One person can't do it on their own, but I've seen that happen. So yes, if it's untreated, if somebody says, no, I'm going to continue to do this. At some point, that person has to decide, what is the cost of me staying? So I'm always a proponent for working on a marriage. But what is the cost to your children when mom or dad is always intoxicated or most often intoxicated? What is the cost of the kids with somebody who disappears for days at a time and then comes back because of drug use or mental illness? So that's not a healthy relationship. And I think sometimes people decide to stay in those relationships for whatever reason, and you've got to evaluate the cost of that. So when I think about marriage, I think about choosing both healthy and lasting. Because look, a financial advisor told us years and years ago when our kids were small, the two most important things to keep healthy is take care of your finances and take care of your marriage. And you probably have said
Those
the
are
same
big
thing.
pluses. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so in doing that, there's stability across the board, especially for the children.
Well, I wanted to mention an example when you mentioned staying in a marriage, but it's not healthy. And I'll change this up a little bit. But someone had mentioned to me that in 27 years, the couple hadn't shared a meal or driven in a car together. And that was a costly relationship to them and their family members and everyone around them. And, looking in a rearview mirror is easy, but, had they maybe sought help, both of them, then it could have been a lasting and healthy marriage, which we
Yes.
all want, but they just had a lasting one
Right.
that eventually ended. But, I was just shocked when you put it in those terms like that. And it's like, what were y'all sharing exactly?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there's also, and I'm sure you've heard this, there's the family meal is tied to stronger connections with the kids. Kids are less likely to use substances. They're more likely to delay sexual relationships. They're just healthier. And what I'm seeing is the family meal is not happening. I have literally sat with people who've said, we never ate together. And so there's something that happens when we break bread and the TV's off and we're sitting together and we're sharing. And so those small connections, even if you're talking about politics or school or finances or whatever you're talking about, it creates a connection. So that family, without even thinking, for 27 years, it just died.
So all those meals that the people that came before us that sat down together, that was just so common, maybe no one even thought twice about it,
Right.
are so important, and they're not so common now.
Right, they're
And we're
not.
seeing a lot of changes.
We are. I think part of it is we're busy. I think
Mhm.
kids can be too busy with all these activities. There's more dual income families, so both mom and dad work. But I still think everybody has to stop and eat.
Mhm.
And we opt out doing that. So we're grabbing a burger on the way home before they go to the soccer game, or somebody's working late or whatever. And it isn't a priority. And I think what we have to do is we have to understand that there are priorities we have to make. And it's to our peril when we quit eating together. It really is. I look at the families that are really struggling, and the family meal just doesn't happen.
So there's some common traits there.
Yes.
Okay. What would be some other common traits?
I think the first one is respect, just making decisions that there are lines we will not cross when we're angry. So I tell people, I do not care how angry you get. Well, that's not true. I don't care that you get angry. What I do care is what you do in that anger. So a common trait in healthy marriages would be we don't cross certain lines. We don't cuss at each other when we're angry. We don't throw things when we're angry. We don't force people to have a conversation when we're unhappy with each other. Going back to the what we make up, I think it's always a good idea to say, is this a good time to talk? Because we don't always know it's a good time to talk. So mutual respect, cherishing, making decisions and reminding yourself sometimes, I love my partner and we forget that when we're angry. Um, I think making decisions that I'm going to treat my partner better than I'm going to treat anybody else. There have been people who say, "Well, I would never talk to my boss that way," but you're talking to your spouse that way, really? So that's a little twisted, but we do it. And I think also I go back to humility, understanding that there are things about me that are not good, and so I can look at my husband's faults with laser accuracy, and mine are just a little bit dim. But when we start paying attention to what we're bringing to the table and understanding that we don't have the whole package, I think that helps us in relationship. It keeps us honest. It keeps us a little bit more humble. And I think that's key in a healthy relationship.
Well, those are all important. I heard someone explain it to me one time is you shouldn't be the most important person in the room.
Oh, that's good.
And so I think maybe that helps. And that's what you've been saying, that the way that person explained it was just a different way to explain it. So I always thought that was helpful.
Yeah, that's really good. That's considering the other, right? If Stephen Covey says, it's, first seek to understand, then to be understood. So often we come across as, I want to be understood. I'm the most important person in the room. I'm taking that with me. But that doesn't work in relationship because then you end up going into a power struggle. And that's not good.
Do we find that sometimes in our relationships, maybe if we're working outside of the home, that we want to bring maybe our position or relationship and work into the marriage, and especially if we're in a position where we're an authority figure or have to make decisions, that maybe without knowing, sometimes we bring that home. And that's not always gender specific. And then we try to have a conversation with our spouse, maybe at an unequal level. And then we just created a problem that we didn't.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And it feels condescending to the person on the other end. So the things that I've heard is, don't put me on the witness stand. Spouse,
okay,
the attorney.
Yep.
I'm not your client. Therapist to spouse. I'm not one of your employees. So talk to me as if we are on a level playing field. So yes, I think we do that. Walking in the house and barking orders because that's what you've done all day, or you've argued all day. So you come in and you're ratcheted up. I think we all have to be careful with that. I tell people all the time, because the language that I use in counseling is like, I talk about boundaries. I talk about being one up. I talk about core negative images. But I say to them, nobody wants to be married to a therapist because it's an unequal relationship, right? And it feels infinitely condescending when we are talking to our partners like they are a client or on the witness stand. So, yeah.
Well, I noticed many years ago that if I had the kids for a long period of time on the weekends when they were little, that I was used to keeping them in control and barking orders maybe and setting up guidelines so people didn't hurt themselves and all the above. And that sometimes you would you would stay in that role that when your spouse came in and it's like, okay, you're not talking to the kiddos now.
Yes.
And it may seem like you've been here forever, but it really hasn't been. And, there's a different person in the room. So you have to adjust how you would communicate, even though it's hard to switch roles like that sometimes.
Right. Yes.
So, okay.
And this made me think about something else too. We parent differently. And our children need the yin and the yang in parenting. So I think it's easy when somebody's in charge of the kids in that moment and the other parent comes in, without even thinking, we can I could go into correction mode. That's not how I do it. And again, that becomes disrespectful because he is absolutely capable of taking care of the kids, right? But we get into this mode of, I've been doing it. This is the way I'm doing it. You're doing it wrong. You're feeding them wrong. You're talking to them wrong. You're playing with them too rough. You're being too easy. Instead of really appreciating the relationship that they have. And it's a unique relationship.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a break right now. And when we come back, we'll be back with Angela Soper, and we'll be discussing tips for a healthy and lasting marriage. Thank you. We'll be right back.
Securities and financial planning offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor. Member FINRA SIPC. The opinions voiced in this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, and financial advisor or tax advisor prior to investing.
We're back. This is Planning for Win, Financial Guidance in Life. I'm Kevin Pinkley, and we're continuing with Angela Soper, and we'll be discussing tips for a lasting and healthy marriage. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
So where would we like to go to now? We've talked about a whole lot earlier in the show.
Well, I think what I want to talk about is, if I can, talk about premarital for a minute.
You bet.
One of the things I wish everybody would do that they would do premarital counseling even before they're engaged. So I'd have to think of a term, pre-engagement counseling. I don't know. But I think what happens so often is there's some churches that require premarital, and some people decide to do premarital. But by that time, the ring's already bought, the date's already set, and often the conversation revolves around the wedding instead of the marriage. And one of the things I love about doing pre-engagement counseling is I talk about the issues that are so common in marriage that people need to fix. And one is finances. So there's finances, sex, in-laws, time, and boundaries. That's to name a few of them. And so what I tell people is people have sex, but they don't talk about it. People have money and they don't talk about it. And those are hot issues. I mean, they really are. And it's interesting. Money is, and you know this better than I do, is so private. I never knew how much my parents made. They talked about money away from me. What I did know was debt was bad and don't use credit cards. That's about all I knew about money. And so I'll talk to couples who have been together for years, even living together, and they have no idea how each manages money.
Well, you're kind of in my wheelhouse
Yeah.
now. So the interesting thing is that, yes, I would completely agree, obviously, with the counseling beforehand, because there's things y'all need to talk about that y'all probably haven't talked about yet,
Right.
that are going to come up anyway. And it's better to come up now. And it's not like you're going to have a solution to everything and have everything worked out, but it needs to be on the radar of, hey, this is going to come up, and we need to be thinking about how we're going to handle it.
Yes.
Whether it's in the immediate future or further out. And one of the things that I would add is, regardless of everyone's background, role, however we're going to consider what our relationship is going to be in the future, my suggestion is both parties need to be an equal participant in all financial decisions.
Yes.
Now, please, I don't mean that we're not going to rely on one spouse more for advice or thoughts. But we both need to know what's going on, why it's going on. I like to use the term is, we need to know where it is, why it's there, and how it works. And it doesn't matter if it's the house mortgage, life insurance, the retirement accounts, whatever.
Right.
That doesn't have to be our thing, but we do need to know why that's there, because it helps us later in those issues you were just talking about. But eventually, we're going to lose a spouse. And we lose a spouse either expectedly or unexpectedly.
Right.
And unexpectedly is something tragic happens and they're gone. And it happens at a time that we usually can't imagine it happening.
Right.
And it happens expectedly that eventually we're not here anymore and we're going to leave this earth. And if we're not an equal participant and understand things, that when we're much older, we're in the same boat as we were when we were much younger,
Right.
In some cases, much worse off. So you have to be an equal participant and run everything by each other. And I'm sorry, I just kind of went off on a tangent, but it's very
I love
important.
that.
Yeah.
It is. And I understand I'm the person who is less knowledgeable when it comes to finances. My husband is really good about that. But we sit down and we talk about, this is what's going on. These are our investments. This is how to get hold of everybody. And we do that periodically. So there have been couples who have no clue at all what investments they have, how much they have in an IRA, if they have an IRA, what's in their checking account, and they've been married for decades.
Right.
So I want people, I agree with that all completely. And what are your values? So let's say you're not engaged yet and you're marrying somebody who says everybody has credit cards. Whatever, go into debt. You can always pay it back. You can pay the minimum, $60,000, $70,000 in credit cards. How people sleep, I don't know. And then the other person says, no, credit cards are bad. You need to invest. If that is something that isn't fixed, that's going to be a fight that happens forever.
Oh, I agree. And you can also add college in there
Yes.
of how we're going to support our children,
Right.
to what degree.
Mhm.
And everybody has a different understanding of that.
Right.
And, together they need to come up with solutions, whatever we're talking about, because just maybe what we experienced or someone else experienced doesn't mean that's what our spouse wants to see happen.
Right.
And, yeah, that could be a real problem.
And
right?
so often we just do what our parents did.
Right.
So if I paid for education, why aren't our kids?
Mhm.
Or if my parents paid for everything, why aren't we paying for everything? And so that warrants a discussion. Sometimes you just have to meet in the middle somehow. But again, I think so often we don't think about it. We just bring into a relationship what we're used to.
I think a lot of times we just assume that our spouse is going to do whatever we suggest,
Right.
or what happens is tell them to do.
Right. And that's one of the things I really appreciated in you saying that you do it together. You're both equal in this, because money is power, or it can be power. And if you feel like you don't understand what's going on, the other person is in a power differential that you created, because you're not asking, you're not getting involved. You're kind of saying, whatever, take over. Also, if you're with a partner who says, this is my money and this is your money, or I will take care of it, just trust me, that is a power differential that you haven't asked for. And that also creates problems. So being able to sit down and carry the burden of that, because money, whether you have it or not, can be a burden. And having it just on one person is pretty tough.
Well, and also, just since we're talking about the finances or money, it's kind of a heads up that if you talk about these things before, a lot of the issues are still going to be there, and you can work them out, and that'll be great. And I don't think this happens a bunch, but you might just have a situation where someone doesn't care about you. And if they're this really, and it's not gender specific, but if they're this really controlling type of person who is not going to involve you in these decisions, a lot of times, many, many years later, when we see a divorce and there is this almost helpless situation because the other person wasn't involved, and when they're not involved, somebody does whatever they want, however they want, and it's really, really bad situation. So
Right.
you might think you have a wonderful person, but again, if they think they're the most important person in the room, maybe you need to think really hard about this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Golly, complicated stuff.
It is. And money's, again, it's an emotional thing. And so if couples would, before they get married, if they would just spend some time talking about issues that are hard, and, family of origin issues. This is how my family does it. This is how your family does it. How involved are families outside of the nuclear family? For example, we have Sunday meals with my parents every week. Is that something you continue when you get married? What if you don't want to do that? What if you want to change traditions? So having these discussions that we don't even think about, I want people to think about it. And I will be honest with you, there have been a few times where I've done pre-engagement counseling and the couples have chosen to end it, which I think they're sad, but I think they've dodged a bullet, because divorce is expensive and it's emotionally devastating. So being able to look at the relationship is important.
Well, when you talked about each spouse's previous family
Mhm.
experience, sometimes that experience for both parties wasn't positive, and
Yes.
it's not something they want to replicate. So we're not really bound to making those same decisions or mistakes moving forward as a couple. We can chart our own course, if you will,
Yes.
and we could just use that as an example of this is what we don't want to do, but just because we both experienced it or maybe one of us did, we don't have to repeat that. Is that a possibility, or are
It
we
is
just doomed to repeat our
no.
our previous history? Yeah.
It is absolutely a possibility, but honestly, we do tend to repeat history.
Mhm.
We don't have to, but we tend to do it. So, what I see, for example, is people who grew up in alcoholic homes end up marrying an alcoholic. Um, for example, and I see this with cheating also.
Mhm.
A mom or a dad cheated, they're in a relationship and there's infidelity. So what we do is we marry people that make sense to us, that there's something familiar that we either
Mhm.
want to change unconsciously or we understand it so we think we know how to deal with it. I think if we step back and we think about marriage is forever. I mean, those really are our vows. I don't know if people who get married and say, well, why don't we try this for 15 years and see what happens and renegotiate? We go in there thinking that it's going to last forever and hoping that it lasts forever. And so we've got to be able to look at what we're bringing in. And if there are things that we say, we don't want to repeat this, then what are we going to do instead of that?
Mhm.
Because just acknowledging, I don't want to repeat this isn't enough. What are we going to replace that with? And often we don't know. We just know we don't know that, but we don't know what else to do.
We need help.
Right. So even thinking about if I'm from a family of yellers and that's how we deal with anger,
Mhm.
if I don't know how to not yell when I'm angry, even though I hated that and I was anxious in that, I don't know what else to do.
Mhm.
So I'm going to yell. So being able to say, and again, I go back to humility. This is
Mhm.
the word that just keeps popping in my brain. I don't have it all together. And there's some things that I don't want to do. And I need help figuring out new tools. So,
And that it's constant. Yes.
yes.
So don't wear yourself out thinking, "My gosh, we're still working on this or there's other things to work on."
Yeah.
It's just there and we'll make improvements, some big improvements, some minor improvements along the
Right.
way, but
Right.
it will always be there. Um, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's reassuring knowing that there's there will probably be something there, but we can work on it along the way and we're not supposed to be perfect.
Right.
Okay. Do you see that people either themselves or with their other spouse think everything should just be perfect, and if it's not perfect, then it's horrible?
Yes.
Okay.
So I have told people I don't think it's a gift to not argue in front of your children. Certainly, there are certain arguments or discussions that should not be had in front of kids. But if kids don't see the repair, mom and dad are mad at each other. They hear the apology and the playfulness. When they get married and there's an argument, I've literally had people say, I mean, we're not meant to be because we argue. My parents never argued. But that's how they did it. So, yeah, we've got to be able to help people know that, again, everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. Everybody does things a little bit differently, and we can chart a different course.
Well, when you mentioned the kiddos there and arguing in front of kiddos, something just popped into my head. We're not only working on our relationship as spouses, we're working on our children's, what
Yeah.
they interpret, what they don't interpret,
Right.
what they see, what they don't see, and then probably what they're going to take on to their relationships.
Yes.
So we need to be conscious of, hey, there's other people that are involved in this process, and we might think it's just us two, but we really need to be mindful that we need to work on this for ourselves, but for our kiddos' relationships as well. Okay.
100%. there's something that I've done with high conflict couples. I've asked them to bring in pictures of their children and describe it in an argument. And one of the things I have them do is I have them look at a picture of their children and say, I know that what I'm about to do is going to break your heart. And your heart's going to be pounding because you're afraid. And tears are going to be running down your eyes. And you're going to be so scared about what mommy and daddy are doing. But frankly, right now, I don't care. I feel like being self-indulgent. And when I say that to couples, there's always this pause. Like, oh my gosh, I never thought about what I'm doing in front of the children. The other thing that I've encouraged people to do is if I talk to my spouse a certain way, imagine my children's spouse talking to them that way. So do I want my kids to say, this is how a wife treats a husband? And if you're doing it well, the answer should be yes. But in our darkest moments, and we all have them, you wince. I don't want my children talking to their spouses this way. I don't want my children's spouses talking to them that way. And our kids are watching. We can, there's that adage about do as I say, don't do as I do. They're paying attention to what we do. They don't really care about what we say. And kids they have sniffers for hypocrisy, right? So, yeah, I think that's
They're
really
paying
important.
attention.
They are paying attention. Yeah. So we're teaching them.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think sometimes we think our kids tune us out, and maybe they do a little bit, but as you said, they're paying attention, and they're aware of what's going on, and they're little people too, and this is going to affect them one way or the other.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they, they're attentive to emotions if we allow them to have emotions. And so sometimes couples say, oh, no, they don't know we're arguing. Yeah, they do. They can feel the tension in the room when you wake up the next morning. Or you honestly think that when you're screaming at each other, the kids are upstairs and they don't hear, they can hear you. So we've got to be very sensitive to how we're dealing with each other. And again, know that the kids, they're paying attention. Kids are snoopy too sometimes.
I can see that. Yeah, they want more information.
Of course,
they want to know what's going on.
Information is power too.
Yeah. Is there times? And I was thinking about this yesterday. I wanted to ask: are there times when we just need our space from each other? And I don't mean like in between a discussion of addressing something.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, we need a break, and whatever a break looks like. And I don't know if a break is an hour or a break is 2 days.
Right.
I guess it's different for everybody, but do we need our space to be our own person also? And is that helpful or not?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
It is. It's critical. So there are some people who think about introverts and extroverts. Introverts get exhausted being around people. They're with a crowd of people. They can perform, and then they leave and they think, oh my goodness, dark room, close the shades, book, quiet. And extroverts are like, that was so much fun. Let's go to another party.
Right.
And often we marry the opposite of who we are. The introvert needs that time. So one of the things I encourage is even driving home, even if you have a commute, the hour and a half commute in Houston is not relaxing. I mean, it really isn't. You can listen to best music, you can listen to a podcast, but you're still, gritting your teeth. So I talk about allow that person 10 or 15 minutes to unwind, just to breathe. Go in another room, just be quiet. Also, I think sometimes saying, go hang out with your friends or go do something by yourself is important because we need to recharge. And so it's understanding your spouse and what their needs are. If you have more of an introverted spouse, give them that space. You will benefit from that because they'll be more recharged and more attentive. And they won't feel drained. And they're not necessarily drained by you, but relationships can be, it can be more of a takeaway than a positive. So yeah, I think it's very healthy. And not in a way of, okay, it's a quid pro quo. If I get to do this, then you get to do that. Just know your spouse. Somebody may need more downtime or me time than you do, and don't take it personally. It's not about you. It's really about getting them back to a place where they can connect.
Makes sense. And I like the fact that you didn't mention that it's not I wanted to say the word test, but that's not. It's not a game to see who can get more activity or more
Right.
space, because I see that with a lot of people. Of, oh, you did this. Well,
Yes.
now I get to
Yes.
do this, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know where that's going, but it doesn't
It
sound
doesn't
like
work.
it's going to work.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
It never does.
Well, I'm curious now. What is that? Is that just like a competition between two couples, or is that too much to cover
No,
today?
well,
Yeah.
just briefly, I think
Yeah.
it's a power struggle. I think there's always, in all relationships, there's going to be power struggles. It doesn't mean big ones necessarily, but I do think one of the things we have to work on as human beings is not keeping score. It's a natural inclination that we do. And it really, again, is to our peril. The worst example I can think of is, well, you cheated on me, so now I'm going to cheat on you. And I've heard that multiple times. And what I do is I step back and say, how's that working for you? So if I'm keeping score, I'm setting us up for conflict. And it just doesn't work. So it's knowing yourself well enough to say, I don't need that downtime as much as he or she does. Take it without keeping score.
So it's very different, and that process is never ending. Then, if we're keeping score,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And then we created another problem.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It takes mindfulness.
Yeah.
We have to pay attention.
What? And I mean, what is more important than our relationship with each other? I mean, when we really get down to it, I mean, we think other things are, but I think if we're truthful, we really want to work at it, and we just need to do more to work at it.
Absolutely.
But it takes two.
It does.
Yeah.
But people talk about relationships at their funerals. We don't talk about accomplishments. That might be mentioned, but the focus is relationship. So we often have that backwards. We're talking about all of our accomplishments, and that's what's most important. But in the end, nobody on a deathbed says, gosh, I wish I worked 40 more hours.
Right.
They want more time with people.
Well, it's like going back to what you were mentioning earlier about sitting down with the family.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of memories there.
Yes.
There's a lot of laughs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of deep thoughts sometimes.
Yes.
And they may not seem important at the time, but they're really important later.
Yes. Agreed.
Well, we covered a lot today, and I learned a lot. And
Thank you.
perhaps, Angela, we could have you back and
Thank you.
continue with the subject, or maybe a
I'd love
different
that.
one. I wanted to thank everyone for listening. Angela, could you tell the listeners how to contact you again, please?
Yes, it's Angela Soper at sopercounseling.com. And Soper is S-O-P as in Peter, E-R.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
This is Planning for Win, Financial Guidance in Life. You can listen to us on the last Tuesday of the month at 1 p.m., or you can find us at Lone Star Community Radio. Thank you very much.